Hey everybody, Aaron Stinner here. We're here in the new shop in our office, and we're here with John Benett, a good friend of mine. I'm really excited about this conversation. John and I have been friends for 20 plus years. We met together in college when we were both working at a bike shop together, and I guess you could say the rest has been history. But we're here to talk about that history today, and excited to get into it. I know your history, but our viewers don't know your history. Tell us a little bit about how you got into riding. I mean, you and I met in the bike shop back in 2007.
Yeah.
And you'd already been riding a little bit before then. So maybe give us a brief background on that.
Yeah, I grew up in Northern California in this town called Livermore, and I got a pretty early start in BMX racing, probably when I was about like 12 or 13. And did that pretty steadily all the way through middle school and high school. And that kind of slowly transitioned into a little bit of mountain bike racing, like dual slalom and four cross. And then sort of phased out for a little bit, and that was kind of when I met you. And I moved here for a very brief amount of time. It was only about maybe about a year. And during that time, I met you from working at a local bike shop here. Which kind of began the beginning of our friendship. And from there, I kind of sort of graduated up into like bigger bikes, away from BMX a little bit. I've always like ridden BMX, and I still kind of do here and there just to stay fresh. But for the most part, it started phasing out, and also like I was just getting injured a lot. I've had some pretty bad ones over the years, and have two bad knees, and so I kind of had to start doing more, safer types of riding, and that kind of became like more mountain biking and like even more road and gravel stuff too. Yeah. Which has kind of been more of the fun things for me lately, is like doing a lot more like mountain bikepacking, but as well as like road and gravel riding too.
Yeah. So when John and I met, I had come off of like road racing a bunch. So I had road raced like all through junior years into college, and was a pretty serious road cyclist, I guess you could say. This was prior to frame building and all that other stuff. And you were kind of coming through the BMX side, not really riding a whole lot of road, but we both kind of got into track bikes. That was like kind of the track bike days. So riding track bikes and doing the fixed gear sprint stuff, which was like kind of a cool melting pot at that point in time of like people from like all kind of different riding backgrounds kind of like hanging out together.
Yeah.
Which was pretty fun.
I should have mentioned that, is that we kind of met because when I first started at the bike shop, I had like a track bike, and this is when street type track bikes were like really new and really cool. It was
MASH
so
days.
that was like the heyday of MASH, and that became kind of like a really easy way to sort of start a friendship, and we started riding around, and the track bike stuff didn't last super long for me, but it was really cool to sort of feel like we're in this like new up and coming sort of corner of cycling, and that stuff's still around today. So.
Yeah, it was super fun. So you started, obviously we met then kind of riding a bit together, like through track bikes, but it's kind of been cool because now you probably ride more than I do by a long shot, and you've kind of like transitioned into like more longer rides, more adventure riding. I think you and I have done Lost and Found together, and a couple other like longer gravel events now. So it's kind of like transitioned into this like bike packing, long road riding, gravel riding. Tell us more about that, because I don't know how long you've been doing the bike packing thing for now, but it's been a few years.
Yeah, it's definitely been a few years, and I mean that kind of came from sort of a couple of good friends who are now like very established like ultra racers, who just sort of invited me along on some trips, and like, would you be interested in going? And I was like, yeah, I'll try it out. And I had some like interest and experience in backpacking, and to me it just sort of felt like this like natural sort of thing of just like, oh yeah, like this is just the same, I can just go a lot farther. And again, I had these like people that were like pretty much like mentors, essentially, like this is kind of what you need, this is what you need to set your bike up, and like these are the routes we're gonna go do, and that kind of stuff. So it really was like me being lucky enough to be included into some of these events and trips and stuff like that with a couple good friends, and from there, yeah, just started becoming more like, these guys are, you know, very experienced, and, you know, would either like, if you're coming, we're gonna do some long days, and I was like, okay, so yeah, it just sort of started changing into like really doing really long days, and just hard rides, and yeah, it's for me, I don't really have as much of an interest in ultra racing as much as it might seem like it. For me, I just like really enjoy like doing hard routes, and I like camping and stuff like that. And I think for me, it's more important just to go out there and like kind of experience it, as opposed to like just hammering through it and like, you know, potentially having to miss some things, or like a cool camp spot, or yeah. And I love, you know, having to be on the road and eating at gas stations and like making it work. And yeah, it's just, it always creates like really funny situations, and like, you know, interactions with locals, and, you know, sometimes really dangerous things, which like ultimately can be kind of fun at the end of it too. But yeah, I think for me, you know, just the sort of scenarios you end up in usually end up being like somewhat comical. Like, you know, it's like, oh wow, this is really terrible. Like, we'll laugh about this later, but right now it's kind of like, you know, not so great. But yeah, I think again, like it all kind of blossomed from really like a couple of close friends that really like brought me in and kind of got me going. And, you know, from there, we just yeah, host a couple of big rides, like some group stuff that we like bring people out to the desert and do some big like multi-day trips. And yeah, that's definitely been kind of my focus lately. Like, we just did a big trip to New Zealand with my girlfriend Ivy and my other friend Mike. And we just did like a 2-week-long, it ended up actually only being about like 8 days of riding, but we rode almost the entirety of the South Island, and that was, you know, kind of like a dream trip for us. It was, you know, something that all of us had wanted to travel to New Zealand for a long time, and all of a sudden we're kind of like at the point with like riding where it's like, oh, we should go do this now, you know? It's like, if we don't do it now, it's gonna be harder as we get older to like make those kind of trips happen. So it's just like, yeah, you know,
How long was that?
The trip itself was about 650 miles, and we rode from the very north tip of the South Island down to Queenstown on this route that's called the Tour de Aotearoa, and it's a really, you know, famous route that a lot of people go there to go do. And yeah, it was hard, it was challenging. There's a lot of weather, there's sand flies, which are crazy. But yeah, in all, it's like, it's really, really pretty. It's a really easy place to tour. Like, you know, people there are really nice. You know, a lot of their economy depends on tourism, so people are like very friendly to you being there. And then just in general, it's just easy. You know, we were like,
were you camping every night?
Not every night, just because like some of the nights we got some pretty bad weather. So we stayed in a hostel. We did stay in a hotel a couple times, but yeah, it was kind of like the whole trip was like almost like did a freestyle. Like, we were rolling into town not really knowing exactly what we would do every single night, and sort of made the best decisions as we were coming, because we did get, you know, they ended up having some really bad weather while we were there, so we stayed in more hotels than we thought, but it honestly didn't end up being a bad thing. We slept in the rain a couple times, and it's like putting away wet tents every night is not very fun, so, or every morning, so. Yeah, it was a really good trip, and I would definitely recommend it to anybody that can make that kind of thing happen.
How do you pack differently when you fly? Like, you got to like pack all this stuff and put it on a plane. Like, and this is coming from somebody. I mean, I've done like one-nighters, and obviously like can kind of overpack when you're doing like a one-nighter. But you're doing trips like through the desert where you got to carry a bunch of water. That's like obviously got its own preparation to it. And then you're like going somewhere where like New Zealand, where you probably are like fairly educated on what you're gonna run into along the way, but you kind of got to plan accordingly, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hardest thing is that like oftentimes, you know, like the weight limit for a bike box that you're packing on the plane is 50 pounds, which like isn't that much. Like, that's kind of like the bike itself and a few things, and then you have to figure out a way to like, you know, you got to keep in mind, like, once you get there, if you're going to be like pedaling out of the airport, you can't bring a bunch of duffel bags and stuff that you're going to carry with you. So like, you have to get really creative about how you're going to bring all your stuff on the plane with you, and have it be feasible to keep either whatever bag you transported in along with you, or like, you know, have it be kind of disposable, like in a cardboard box. And for New Zealand, we traveled with cardboard boxes because, you know, we were starting at the tip of the island and then ending at a totally different area, so we couldn't bring our travel cases. So yeah, that made it definitely a bit of a challenge, is like trying to get our kits really light and get them on the plane with us, and, you know, be able to save, you know, space and weight and stuff like that. It's also like really funny, like traveling to a different country for 2 weeks with like almost nothing, you know what I mean? Like we're like on the plane, like essentially in our PJs, you know what I mean? And like slippers and stuff like that, and like carrying like, you know, my girlfriend Ivy makes a lot of bags. She made this really cool frame bag on this bike and a bunch of other bags. She made us these big tote bags essentially that are made out of like, you know, ripstop, like really, really lightweight stuff that we were able to put all our stuff in to bring as our carry-ons. And then, you know, the bags were so small and compact, we just shoved them in the bottom of our panniers. And that's like how we got, you know, the bulk of our, like the handlebar bags and the panniers and stuff like that. And then in the bike box, you know, you just put your light stuff, like your sleeping bag and your down stuff that's like bulky, but it's not gonna take a lot of weight. So there is some like preparation and a lot of like thought that needs to go into it, but you do it a couple times and you kind of figure it out and you're like, okay, this is just, you know, how you have to do it.
Yeah.
But yeah, again, traveling to another country with like 2 outfits, you know, and no real shoes, like, you know, just like bike slipper kind of things. It's like, it's kind of a funny feeling. But it's also, you know, once you've done it for a while, then you just feel comfortable. You're just gonna look like a traveling backpacker person the whole time you're there, you know, there's no like, you don't really have like a lot of style out there, so, but it's fun too. It just makes it a totally different dynamic and makes you like rethink like what you really need when you're traveling too. Like it's kind of sweet, so.
Yeah, so you've done, obviously you've done like desert, I kind of alluded to in the beginning, and we won't get too far into John's setup in this video. We did do a bike check video. We'll put that down in the bottom for you guys to connect over to see that video, and where he talks more about his gear, the bike setup itself. But we obviously built this bike, a tunnel, which we talked about in the bike check video, but we built this one to be a little bit more bike packing friendly, and that was kind of like over a culmination of a lot of these trips. You kind of had like, all right, because like a lot of people come to Stinner and they're like, I want to do, like either it's their first trip or it's their second trip, and they're kind of like want to get into this sport, but they don't quite know they haven't put all the pieces together. You've obviously done enough trips where you probably have like a core kit and like you know what you need every time you're going, I guess, like depending on the trip. But tell us about like how that's evolved over time, because I know you had a Refugio at one point that you were bike packing on, right? Were you bike packing on the Refugio?
Yeah, actually for a long time I used like essentially like a gravel bike that it had gone through a bunch of different the Refugio.
I think it was the gravel bike.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was the green one. I mean, this was a long time ago, like 2018 or something, but that bike almost slowly turned in from a 700C gravel bike into like a 650B like mountain bike, and that's what I used for bikepacking for a long time, and like took that on some really hard rides, like stuff like looking back and I was like, man, that was an aggressive thing to do on that bike, but it held up great, and that's essentially what I got started on, was more or less like a gravel bike with 650 by like 2.0 tires, and that did actually really well for a long time.
That was a steel one.
It was steel, yeah. It was steel, and it was kind of custom. I think it was more cross geometry back then, like traditional cross stuff. But yeah, that worked out great for a while. But through that, I kind of started learning, like, you know, the biggest thing that happens when you're first starting is you end up bringing way too much stuff. And that's always the thing, is like you think you're gonna need all these things, and you might be nice to have these extra things, but over time, like the goal is really to get your pack as simple as possible and as light as possible.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that's like just the thing, is like every trip you're learning more about what you're gonna need and what you're kind of like gonna expect, I guess, you know, whether it's gonna be like a heavy weather trip or a heavy water trip, you know. And that definitely determines what you're gonna bring and what kind of like sort of, you know, emergency, necessities that you might need, like, you know, a water filter or like a shelter or something like that, versus like, you know, if we're going out in the desert, we know it's gonna be good weather, we can kind of just like cowboy camping on the ground, where it's like, yeah, we still bring a shelter for the most part, or some way of like getting out of weather if we need to, but oftentimes, you know, in the desert we'll just sleep on the ground, versus like in the Sierras, you got to worry about like mosquitoes and bugs and stuff like that, where you definitely need more protection and like, you know, just a way to kind of get out of the elements if you need to. So, but yeah, and like I said too, like just having guidance from my friends and stuff, you know, guys that already had done this and made all the mistakes, and like you can talk to them and like really like refine like what you need to bring, and it kind of becomes fun, you know, like you really start figuring out like over time, like it sort of feels like scary, like going out with like so minimal things, but like at the end of it, it's like, okay, I did this last trip and I didn't touch any of these things that I carried the whole time. It's like, yeah, then you don't bring it again, you know? And yeah, over time, it really is like this like bare necessities kind of thing in your pack. And that's like, you know, we don't need to bring like games and stuff at night, you know, we'll bring a deck of cards and, you know, a little flask of whiskey or something, and that's your entertainment, you know? Oftentimes you go to bed early too. It's just like, we're never up until midnight, In the wintertime in the desert, you're like asleep at like 7 because it's just like it's just dark at 5 and it's like
you're tired.
There's just not much to do. And there's a lot of times where you can't have fires, it's just like there's elements to every different trip that make it, more or less like a really comfortable experience at camp. And sometimes it's just like you just want to go to bed and wake up and get going the next day. So.
Yeah. But eventually you evolved into, I think right after Refugio, we got the tunnel. So we did the tunnel project, which is a custom version of the tunnel. It's 120 mil of travel. But otherwise, I think most of the other geos like kind of close. I think obviously made it work around a 120 fork instead of a 140. Like the standard tunnel is definitely more of a rowdy hardtail versus this is set up more kind of cross country style. It's tie bike, so we went tie, so it's lighter. And just to get the weight down all around. I know you've been on a tie kick too. You love all the tie bits and bobs. Again, probably from a weight perspective.
And I think just like it became cheaper over time to like acquire titanium parts. It's just like the price on it became lower and it just became easier and like it is more durable most of the time.
Right, and more available. So I think the only thing that's new, because I've kind of seen your evolution of like how you've been doing it. We chat obviously very often, so I get a lot of feedback. But the pack setup's pretty new, right, for the year? So this is...
Yeah.
I was excited to see this, the new tailfin stuff, right?
Yeah. I mean, that is a big difference is, we've had some really cool people at Tailfin kind of like helping us out. And like, I've got like an entire new to me, like Tailfin setup on this. And it's definitely like a kind of game changer out there. And it's all really, very well engineered. Like everything on there, you're just like, how did you guys think of this? Like it's all like reversible and like, it's just everything is very, very well thought out and like, almost like to the best I've ever seen in any bike product, it's like, it's really, really cool.
Which is helpful when you like kind of what you're saying, it's like you're learning from people that have done a lot of this. And I feel like, 15, 20 years ago, there wasn't as much gear around it. And it's like cool to see somebody like Tailfin that's taking their years of knowledge and experience and putting it into a product. So that way, like when we do recommend or talk to people about bikes and they're like, hey, how do I want to set this up for bike packing? Or how do I want to set this up? You can kind of like point them in a direction of product now where you can be like, this is like really well thought out. And like, you're getting a lot of experience out of the people that are designing this and making this and like probably making your life a little bit easier, at least in the beginning. Like it feels like the barrier of entry is lower now because there's like so much good, well-created like bike packing stuff that's out there.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the biggest thing with Tailfin is like they're coming purely from like an ultra background, where it's like the people that are riding this stuff and the people that are helping them develop them are like ultra racers and they're like the best of the best. So it's just like, this isn't even like the lightest weight setup on here. Like this is a pretty heavy duty, like totally waterproof. Like, and we went through a lot of weather in New Zealand and I can definitely attest that like it's 100% waterproof. But yeah, it's just like as much as even like, it's hard to see from probably in this view, but like the cockpit setup, I mean, just having all your little like doodads and having really good light mounts, like that stuff is really crucial. And then like also just being able to take the bags off, like I've had so many setups where stuff is like, totally fixed to the bike. And, it's, if there's like crazy weather or something like that, you want to be able to bring your stuff inside and like put it under your tent or your vestibule or whatever, and having like, a handlebar bag that you can take off with like one switch and your panniers that pop off and like, you can do it in like less than a minute, have all your stuff off and like get dry. It makes such a big difference. And again, like the way they did it all was just very, very smart. And it came from purely like, lots of like on the road testing. Like it wasn't from like a lab or something, it's from them out actually like, listening to riders and seeing what works best. And
it's not a bunch of designers just trying to sell you something.
No, it's like purely, it's like, but and they're just a really cool company. So I really like their stuff. And then, I mean, I have to mention again, like, this frame bag also is from my girlfriend's company, which is called Ivanhoe. And I would say one thing to get back to the bike a little bit too is we talk about it in the bike check video, but this frame bag actually like bolts into the inner triangle of this frame. Right. And the cables are also routed onto the same hole. So everything is like, just like, it's perfect. I mean, it's just like, there's not really a better way to do it. It's something that the frame bag is essentially like fixed to the bike, but for the most part, I just put stuff in there that's not going to need to be put like totally waterproof, like or things that are already in dry bags or something like that. And that definitely, it's a different sort of setup for that, but it works really, really well.
So done a bunch of Death Valley. What was your first big trip that you did?
I mean, the first probably like week-long trip has been a couple things in Death Valley over the years, with again like the same guys that I've done many trips. But yeah, the first one where I was like out for like multiple days with no resupply and like really having to think about water is definitely Death Valley, which like it seems really intimidating the first time you do it, but like over time, like you really learn again, like. The main thing is like where you can get water, but also like having emergency water storage and, like kind of just knowing what to expect and just being like, yeah, my bike's gonna be really heavy for a couple of days and that's just what it is, and just get used to it. I mean, everybody else's bike is heavy too, so it's not like you're gonna have a huge disadvantage, but yeah, I'd say Death Valley was really big. Last year I did with my good friend Mike, we rode from Reno to Mendocino on a really cool, like very old school route that's called the Trans Northern California, and it's like an old school ultra route that was really cool. That was like a big one I wanted to do forever just because it's so local to me, and like you cross the Sierras in a couple of days and then you have to cross the Central Valley, which is like kind of crazy because it's just like you go from being like really high up to like just out in the valley where it's like super hot within like a day. So it's just yeah, you just go through like a bunch of different like ecosystems and stuff like in a very short period of time. Yeah, we did it I think in like 5 days or something like that, which yeah, that one was really, really cool. And I think just in general, like we're really lucky in California to have like so many different environments to go do this stuff. And it's like, like within one ride, you can go from like the desert to the mountains, and like there's not a whole lot of other places where you can really do that. And I feel like we do that on a regular basis, so.
Yeah, so you've done a couple of these big bikepacking trips. You still got a couple of them planned coming up. More stuff in the desert. You and I were talking a little bit too, like as this is, and maybe it's just like with how much you're riding now and the training that you're doing and like riding on the road more as you like kind of like are, I guess, I don't know what the right word is, but you're like developing more of, I mean, you obviously have a huge base to be able to go do these big rides anyway, but it seems like you guys have been getting more into road riding and doing these big road loops. And doing a little bit more credit card camping and doing that stuff. So like, what are you excited about doing next? So you got, you just did New Zealand. And I know you have another desert trip planned, but after that, like what do you want to do more of? Like, what are you looking forward to? We kind of touched on, you are looking for a gravel bike again, so we might be doing another gravel bike at some point, because you've been without a gravel bike. John, over the history of us being friends, has owned 9 Stinners, which we haven't even really gotten into, but he's kind of been our test dummy on a lot of new product. That's why he's kind of the first one to have a tunnel with a 120. But anyway, like, what are you doing next? Like, why a gravel bike? Like, what do you?
Yeah, I mean, the getting into the kind of credit card touring thing, like, the biggest downside of it is like, obviously there's a cost that comes with it a little bit more, but like oftentimes you're staying in hotels that are usually not in like the most, like expensive areas, but just that's been really fun. I mean, we've done a couple recently, and it's kind of more something I can do with Ivy, my girlfriend, as well too. And she's like a really established road rider, and she can go do that stuff. And it's just like, it's easy, it's fun. Like you're still packing some stuff, but essentially you just bring like an outfit, and like, you don't need a stove or a sleeping bag, all that kind of stuff. And like you can do like super long days, like we're pushing like 120 sometimes. And we did one recently kind of near Yosemite where we went over to the Sierra, like one side of the Sierras to like the 395, and then came back pretty much the next day. And it's just like, it's kind of feasible to do these things that used to feel like impossible. And it's like, I think that, right now I have the Carrizo, which is like a, all road bike that I have about like 35 C tires on, and like still ride plenty of off-road on it too.
Yeah, totally.
But yeah, I mean, like just being able to do, like these big monster days, and then like you get to a hotel and go to a cool restaurant, like you get to, spend time in towns that you just never like would otherwise really like spend time in. Yeah, and like bikepacking is cool in a different way. Like you're going to go way out in nature and get away from all this stuff, but it is cool to kind of explore these like smaller cities and areas of California that, like, for the most part, like I just wouldn't really travel to in a car as much. And on a bike, you're just like, you get to go there and check them out and spend time there, and have a nice meal, like I said, of not just eating, and not just eating like freeze-dried food every night too, which is kind of nice. And yeah, it's just different. And the gravel bike thing, it's just like, to kind of be able to like link some more longer rides together that, again, would be a little bit much for the Carrizo. And yeah, I just feel like at this point, it's like the one thing that's kind of missing from the quiver is like a real proper, you know, bigger tire gravel bike right now. So.
Yeah. So which is like, so you and I talked a little bit about this weekend because you were here in town, but which I'm really excited about doing too. So hopefully the next time you're around, we're gonna be able to maybe cobble some stuff together and maybe do a report or a video on. But I know we've been talking about, you've done a lot of stuff out in Carrizo, but maybe exploring the Los Padres a little bit more here in our backcountry, like Buckhorn Road and doing some of that. And I think a Refugio actually lends itself really well to the riding that's back there, so you can like still cover some ground and get where you need to go.
I think that's what I would like, is like to have a bike that like there's like literally no circumstance. Like even if I'm kind of like under biking it, I could still do it, you know, essentially. And like that's what I think Refugio would be perfect for right now. And like obviously you guys designed it around these areas, which is not forgiving. So I think, yeah. And I've done, you know, a couple bikepacking trips around Los Padres, and I've even done pretty much from, you know, one side straight to Santa Barbara, and it's like, it's ridiculously hard. So it's yeah, I mean, it's just like having a bike that you could do like really long days, and also just like, you know, sometimes it's nice to do rides where you're doing a bit of road and a bit of dirt too, and like that's the reality of having like a gravel bike on those things, and like something that's like, you know, capable of bike packing on is, yeah, it's just, to me right now, it sounds really inviting. And so that's like definitely the next bike on the list, is to build like a real, you know, modern gravel bike. So
Sweet.
Yeah, I think that's going to be really exciting to do this year.
Well, thanks for hanging out.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, no, thank you. Again,
stoked you got to check out the new shop.
Yeah, no, this is, yeah, it's always awesome. It's really fun coming down here and seeing everything always like progressing and evolving. And it's just like every time I see it, it's just like the next step, the next step, the next step. And even like last year, that you're like moving into that shop, and now it's moving into this shop, and it's just like, yeah, it's just ramping up every time I come down. So it's like, it's really exciting to see from afar, and I think everybody's kind of really stoked to see where it goes.
Thanks. Yeah, no, we're excited, and hopefully the next time you're down, we're doing some riding and documenting some riding, and maybe on a new Refugio. And yeah, we'll have more to check in on. Cool. Thank you guys. Thanks for checking in. As always, like and subscribe. Gonna do more of these videos, and hopefully the next time John's here in town, we got an update for you guys on what he's up to, and go from there. Thanks.